this so that it can be a resource later on. As I begin the session today, I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the traditional lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees Nation. With gratitude, I live, work, and gather here where the past and present of future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can come together. Doing land acknowledgements, a small sign of reconciliation, just one way that we can affirm the past and present home of the families of these lands and honor the practice of respectful acknowledgement and their deep ties to it. We can also go beyond a land acknowledgement by making a personal action plan highlighting concrete steps to take to support Indigenous communities into the future. We can give of our time, our funds, our expertise, and we can also do more research to learn about the history of our local Indigenous people and how we can be better allies. Now, today, before we begin our fascinating talk from Cheryl, I'm just going to let you know about a few events that we have available here for CPRS people and local communicators. So CPRS Vancouver Island is partnering with the 9th Annual Summers BC Communications Forum. And this forum is 2 days, both online and in person here in Victoria at the Inn at Laurel Point. And this event features speakers both with board member Nicole Sendy and Robin Quinn, a CPRS Vancouver Island past president and CPRS fellow. There's a QR code there if you want more, but after I'm done talking, I'll put the links into the chat, which can be a little easier to access. As well, while we're talking conferences, this talk actually was first featured at the 2024 CPRS National Conference in Mont-Tremblant, Quebec. I was fortunate enough to be able to see this talk, so I'm really excited to share it. To help share it with all of you today. And if you're interested in connecting at this year's conference, it's being held in Banff on May 25th to 27th. And there's early bird rates available until April 1st. Oh, I did forget to mention with the local Summers Conference, there are special CPRS rates available too. Now, just a bit of a tease on what's coming up in the rest of our programming for this year. So save the date. We have booked a next Lunch and Learn for March 5th with the Colleen Mycroft, Manager of Intergovernmental and Media Relations for the City of Victoria. Social media, when to turn off the conversation. I think I'm probably not alone in a bit of a fascination on the fact that the City of Victoria turned off their comments on social media. And I was really excited to learn more about that. So I will be ready on the edge of my seat on that one. Then in the spring, we're having some member meetups and connection opportunities in Victoria and Nanaimo, and we'll finish up our year with our June annual meeting. Now, next we have Cheryl and her talk, World at Your Door. So I will step aside and open up the floor to Cheryl Major, the Director of Community Engagement Division at the Victoria Police Department.
Hi, everyone. I will start sharing my screen in just a moment so you can see the slides that we have here. I do have a presentation, I think about 40 minutes, and then we should have some time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. So I really appreciate you all being here, and I'm really happy to see you. So just give me a second here while I can share my screen. Okay, great. So as mentioned, I'm Cheryl Major, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we've learned during what is now 66 weeks of protests in Victoria. I also would like to acknowledge that the land where I'm working today and presenting from is located on the Lekwungen and Songhees traditional people, or territory of the people, and I acknowledge the historical impact that policing has had on these peoples and their relationships with lands. I'd like to thank CPRS Vancouver Island for having me and for all of you for being here today. And I can hear some people coming into the waiting room. Just to note that I can't see you with the way I'm presenting today, so if you do have any questions, I believe we're planning to wait until the end for those, and you can put any comments into the chat and Ali will be monitoring that for us. So today I'm going to give you some insight into the world of police communications and some of the lessons that we've learned over those 66 weeks of continuous issues management that has a local, regional, and global nexus. I'll give you some background on Victoria as a city, because I don't think everybody who's here is from Victoria. Our police department and my public affairs section, an overview of our communications tool that we've used, and some factors impacting our communications environment through this time, as well as some interesting points of learning that we've had in what has been a really long, sustained time. I hope you'll walk away from our discussion today with a better understanding of what we do in our world of police communications, which is reflected in your communities if you're not from here, and probably in your practices as well, but also some reminders about how some of the base principles of communications, which we all know, play out in this environment. So while I was developing this discussion, I realized that we've actually put quite a lot of work into doing what amounts to really very little when it comes to output of communications projects or products. But as you'll see over the next little while, every word counts, and that each very little came with a lot of thought. So just a quick trigger warning. Today we're going to be talking about some issues that may be upsetting to anyone who has any connection to the Israel-Palestine conflict, or in the case of one section, anyone who's connected to the LGBTQ2S plus community. It could also be upsetting to anyone who has experienced an occupation or who has PTSD from first responder experience. I've really made sure to avoid using any upsetting graphics, but the reality is that we are talking about a conflict that has claimed many, many lives and which has a lot of passions on both sides. For that reason, I'd also like to just set out a couple of rules of engagement. So while I realize that there are very strong passions and fears on both sides of the conflict that we're discussing, and that both religion and politics have come into play, I will ask everyone to just take a neutral stance for our time together today, as we focus on just the communications aspect of how this is played out in the form of demonstrations in Victoria. I definitely acknowledge and respect that some people in the room or here may have personal connections to the conflict, and I honor those experiences, but I ask us all to maintain a civil conversation and stay focused on the topic today. I'd also like to frame our conversation with the knowledge that the role of police in these scenarios is to ensure public safety and to uphold the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A key message that we use is that we police behavior, not beliefs. These are two items that are the absolute bottom line for us in every decision: safety and personal rights and freedoms. And they drive every decision that's made. It's also important to remember that police believe fundamentally that they serve for and of the people. So they very much see themselves as part of the community and their role as keeping that community safe. So I know many of you here are from Victoria, but let me just tell you quickly about Vic PD and the area that we police in case you're from out of town. We serve the city of Victoria and the township of Esquimalt. We police a population of about 125,000 people, but we also have all of the bars and nightclubs for the larger Greater Victoria area, and we're one of the top tourist destinations in Canada, bringing people in from around the world, and we have the highest crime severity index of any municipal jurisdiction in BC. We also have a very high relative population of persons experiencing addiction, persons experiencing homelessness, and persons who are in various states of support and recovery for each of those. For policing, this means that we are a hotspot for the criminal element that preys on and extorts vulnerable persons, tourists, as well as local residents. We address all of this with a staff that are operating around 80% capacity, which means that only 80% of the officers we actually need to do the job are in filled positions and able to do the full range of police activities. In short, we're a very busy department with a staff who work a lot of overtime to make up the shortfall. And this is an important context because staffing protest activity is all done on overtime. It's an extra shift, an extra weekend away from the kids, or another parent that has to take on everything family related for an additional day. And it's rest that they're not getting in between their regular shifts. And the City of Victoria, of course, is no stranger to protests and demonstrations, as I'm sure you've seen firsthand or seen in the news. In 2023, we policed 71 demonstrations, and in 2024, we policed 130 demonstrations. So what does our community engagement look like? We use a community-first approach to communications, which means that we use our platforms to communicate directly with the citizens we serve, rather than primarily relying on media to relay the information for us. We do respond to media requests, of course, but we prioritize telling the stories that we feel are most important to community safety or that the community needs to know for awareness. And the media, of course, are welcome to use our content and stories that we put out. Part of the reason we can do this and telling our own stories is that we've built a significant following on social media. And also because policing is actually one of the most trusted public institutions in Canada, as according to an Ipsos Reid survey in 2023. We also have a well-staffed public affairs and engagement section. Our public affairs section consists of myself, 2 communications coordinators who are civilians, and a police spokesperson. We also have a national and world-leading experts in their field within our department as subject matter experts who are often called on to comment on things. So as a result, overall, we are a primary source of information about what's happening in the city quite often, and a go-to resource for comment on crime, trends, and other applicable issues in the region. So when it comes to protests in communications, we typically release projected road closures or disruptions. So people get permits to have demonstrations on the legislature lawns. We become aware of those permits and we will issue a notice if we think that there's going to be, or we become aware that there's going to be a march or some kind of demonstration that would come off of the legislature lawn. So we are usually advising people to avoid the area. Now, I just want to give you this as a bit of context. In September 2023, the Anti-Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Group had planned a protest regarding some topics that were being taught in schools. And it soon became clear that the LGBTQ2S+ community was going to counter-protest en masse. In this case, the information that we had told us that this was going to be a really intense event. And so we borrowed a tool from our friends at the Calgary Police Department and created a guide to peaceful protest in hopes of managing behavior. And I'll share more on that tool later, and Ali will give you a link to it a little bit later as well. But what followed on that day was one of the most tense situations that any of our officers have experienced at the legislature. I checked again this week, and that statement still holds true despite the numerous protests that we've had since then. At one point, we had a call for all hands on deck, so any officer who could put on a uniform was called out of the offices here in Caledonia and asked to report downtown to hold the line between 2 opposing parties, resulting in speech platforms being shut down, advising and a march being canceled. And in that case, what we actually did was we advised the people who had planned a march that we would not be able to keep them safe if they chose to march. They, of course, still had the choice to march. And we also posted a notice advising residents to avoid the area and not go near one of our busiest tourist locations because the area was no longer safe. A senior officer shared with me that this event ranks among his worst experiences as an officer because the tension and the violent rhetoric was so high on that day. This is a photo from the Times Colonist. I'll give them appropriate credit. That, to me, I think displays some of the tension that was there that day. In the end, in that day, there was just 1 arrest, but officers were on site on the lawn for about 11 hours, just working to keep everybody safe. So it was a really unpleasant day, but I give you the scenario because it paints a picture of what we're used to in terms of demonstrations or the kinds of things that we experience here, and why we were able to make decisions about staying quiet and developing a solid communications tool and preparing for what was coming next. So, October 7th, 2023, Hamas launches a deadly attack on Israel. Approximately 1,200 people are killed and more than 250 people, including bodies, are kidnapped and taken into Gaza. A UN team later mentioned that they had found reasonable grounds to believe that some victims had been sexually assaulted as well. Immediately after, VicPD officers provided additional support to vigils and mourning events at Jewish centers throughout our jurisdiction. We provided a presence, offering a feeling of safety to those who gathered to mourn and listening to concerns. We also worked with centers to ensure that their safety plans were up to date. So if they had an event at their center, what it would look like to go into lockdown, what it looks like to get out safely, how they can effectively communicate with police when they're calling for emergency services. On October 9th, Israel ordered a complete siege of Gaza, and by early November, the death toll had passed 10,000 and demonstrations had begun around the world. The first full pro-Palestine demonstration occurred in Victoria on November 4th. And since that date, we've had, as I mentioned, 65 consecutive weeks of demonstrations with attendance ranging from 250 to 750. So this week will be week 66. And a reminder, the role of VicPD in protests is to ensure public safety and to protect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And to offer just a little bit of insight, our work is not just on the ground on the day of the event. We actually use protest liaison officers to work with groups ahead of their planned demonstrations to help ensure safety. We monitor the events, we provide feedback on the language that they've used during their demonstration and their activities that they've done, and they really work on developing those relationships. And I think those relationships have been really important in keeping our demonstrations peaceful and well managed. And just a second to commend all of our officers who have put in an immense amount of dedication and professionalism to manage those events for so long. For your interest, this is what it looks like from the other side. This is a command post within our headquarters here in Victoria. We establish a command post where we use CCTV, closed caption television cameras, and recording to monitor the activity that's on the ground and to coordinate any activity that needs to happen. So whether we need to move assets, people, or vehicles into different spaces based on if we see tensions building. It's a little bit of an eye in the sky place. In the command post, there is a commander, an operation planning sergeant, an operation planning coordinator, and some other key positions as needed. We do not have communications staff member in the CPs every weekend, but I'm usually available and on call for if we need to put some messaging out. Now you'll note in one of these pictures that the CP was staffed entirely by female police officers and civilians filling each of those positions. So it's one thing I just noticed and was quite proud of. So let's get into some of the communications tools that we use during this time. As noted earlier, we have significant reach and a relatively well-staffed public affairs section. However, in preparation for what was coming with the Soji protests, as I mentioned before, we borrowed a tool and best practices from the Calgary Police, and we issued a quick guide to safe and peaceful demonstrations. So this tool is essentially a series of slides outlining the rights and responsibilities of citizens around lawful assembly. These are 3 of the slides. There's 6 in total, and Ali will put the link to the full guide, which lives on Instagram, out there for you guys to take a look at as well. The intent of this was to better, ideally we would like to sort of not control behavior, but sort of manage expectations and manage people's understanding. We wanted to let them know what they could and could not do, where they might run into trouble based on their choices, and also to better manage the expectations of those who want us to take action against the demonstrators with enforcement. So we want to better educate everybody about what are you actually allowed to do and what is illegal and what's just annoying. The key message here, which we've reiterated for ages, is that we police behavior, not beliefs. And that's really important because it reminds people that the police do not take a partisan stance on any issue, that we enforce the laws the same way for any group, and that we're not going to take action against a group based on public opinion or public pressure. And this last point is an ongoing effort. I can tell you we are getting a lot of pressure, especially as the weeks go on, to take, and in some cases we're getting online harassment to take action. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So as I mentioned earlier, this has been a lot of work and discussion in doing what essentially amounts to very little. And I think many of us can relate to that, as success in managing an issue often looks very different from the outside, despite the duck turning legs under the water very quickly that happens in our offices. So we have essentially issued a weekly community update with a few key changes that I'll touch on in the next session, or in the next section. We've used social media to remind our community of these events as a public service announcement and to remind participants of their responsibilities with the guide. So we've gone back to that guide several times, especially when we thought that people might need to be reminded of expectations. We also maintain high-level key messages about our response and our focus on supporting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which comes above Motor Vehicle Act and things like that as well, for responding to inquiries and any letters that we get from the public. Since I presented this last year, we've had a significant decrease in the number of inquiries, letters, or direct actions for request, bar Twitter, and some social media activity, which I'll touch on in a little bit. I want to explore a few different factors that have been that were impacting our communications environment. So the first factor was to impact our approach to communications was the sheer number of communicators that would be involved and how to coordinate messages between all of those groups. So we knew that anything that we said, anyone who was on the ground said, could impact both our reputation, but also policing in general, and could make or break relationships that were needed in order to keep people safe, those protest demonstration relationships that I talked about a little bit earlier. So we have our leadership team, of course, the chief of police. We have our professional communicators, my team, the protest liaison team officers, who I spoke to a little bit earlier, community resource officers are officers who are in the ground, out on the ground, in the community all the time, talking about working with people who are on the streets, working with different interest groups, businesses, people who may be impacted by the ongoing demonstrations. And of course, we have the officers who are on the ground actually policing the demonstrations and the activities that are taking place each day. So we started talking about key messages and training, but it quickly became clear that we simply had to rely on trust. And thank goodness that we had that established well in advance. So talking about trust, it was definitely my job to trust that every officer had as their first priority the intent to see as little harm done as possible. Now, when these demonstrations started, I had worked at Vic PD for a little less than a year, and I had a lot to learn about policing and police officers and the way that we do operations. So you might think also that I was a little risk averse. I did consider tools like giving everyone message cards with key messages and say, only speak to this. We talked about doing daily briefings, reminding people to stay in their lane and what kind of messages were appropriate. But really part of my learning was to learn how to trust their training. And it was really the other side of trust that did this for us, that helped us be successful, because everyone who was involved knew that it was our job, the professional communicators, to be involved, to be apprised of what was going on, to understand the situation, and to make recommendations, and to take the lead on anything public. So that doesn't mean that I was at every demonstration or in the command post, as I mentioned, but that no one was taking a stand or making a statement that wasn't in line with the corporate message and the bottom line outcome, which is protecting rights and freedoms and keeping everybody safe. So while we didn't rely on coordinated messaging, we were all focused on consistent and transparent communications and building trust. This mostly worked, as you'll see, but it was a great way to learn how highly valued communications was here at Vic PD, and I really value that, and how important it was, especially in a situation like this. And just a note on the importance of impartiality and some of the impacts that can take place when someone kind of goes out of that line. In 2022, before I was here at Vic PD, an officer gave a thumbs up gesture during an anti-COVID protest. So they wanted COVID restrictions to end. A police officer went by and he gave a thumbs up. This was photographed, and it became a really big deal. and it's a thumbs up, right? Not saying anything. He was in fact responding to positive comments from the crowd, like, "Hey, Vic PD, we love you," that kind of thing. But of course, it was captured as and portrayed as supporting the event, as being in line with what the demonstrators were calling for. So imagine if he had in fact made a statement or provided a personal opinion, or tried to build relationships by saying, "Yes, I'm on your side," and if that had been recorded and put out there. So the impact of something as small as a thumbs up from a police officer can be really big. We also had a lot of external pressures. So not long after the demonstrations began, we started getting requests for our chief of police, Del Manick, who's there, to make a statement denouncing violence and racism. In fact, we've had numerous calls for our chief to denounce violence from both sides of this issue, despite there not being any actual violence in the area. Of course, we were going to see violence during the demonstrations, and we had included that any unsafe or illegal behavior would be met with de-escalation and enforcement in our general messaging. But there's a really big difference between general messaging and a chief's statement. In particular, our chief is very proactive and outspoken. He's a leader in the field, and he also happens to be BIPOC. He is a dynamic speaker with a huge platform who captures attention and leads change. A statement from him would impact not only our jurisdiction, but policing as a community, and could be held up as an example of, you see, he's on our side, or even that all of the police are on our side. The impacts of a statement from our chief, and most chiefs, in fact, would be far-reaching, and in this case, with the potential to be global. So the pressure was really strong. Weekly requests for meetings with national organizations, a lot of letters, a lot of phone calls and requests for things. We took the time to listen, but in the end, we took the stance that an act of violence would actually have to occur to trigger a chief level statement about what was happening. And to this point, Chief Manick has not made any kind of statement about the ongoing demonstrations. Our pressures also came from what other police departments were doing. Other communities had a different experience than what we have seen here in Victoria in terms of violence, in terms of relationships with their protest groups and the responses they were getting, as well as their own reactions to their responses. So just for a second, I want to highlight another Calgary piece, actually. Here, the Calgary Police Chief is quoted as saying that he expects there will be more arrests during future demonstrations. And so that was reported out in the media. There will be more arrests. So predictably, both demonstrators and counter-protesters felt that it was unfair for the police chief to make the assumption that they would engage in arrestable behavior. And I haven't talked to them, but I'm sure that this statement damaged the relationships with Calgary Police that they had with both groups. As a note, we've actually had 2 arrests during demonstrations here in Victoria. In one incident, a man drove his vehicle towards a demonstrator who had to jump out of the way of the vehicle. An officer was on site, witnessed this, arrested the man on site, and he was charged with dangerous operation of a motor vehicle. We decided at the time that that wasn't enough to trigger a chief level statement. And later on, there was a case of blatant hate speech during a demonstration, and that individual was arrested and was charged. Again, it wasn't violence, it wasn't a large group chanting blatant hate speech, and so again, it didn't trigger a sort of chief level response. Another external factor we had to contend with was an active petition by a running candidate for the BC Conservative Party. And at the time, they were running or getting ready to announce the run for political office. In this petition, we are asked to protect peaceful protest and to disallow the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which, as I noted, are actually legally peaceful. This candidate took to social media and looked for 5,000 signatures. He got just over 700. I believe the petition's still active there. And I'll just note that that person did not win their position, and I think they are currently working on suing the police for allowing continued demonstrations to occur. There was also a case of the BC Conservative Party holding a press release stating that our reluctance to make arrests was due to the unwillingness of Crown Counsel to pursue charges. This release referenced a statement that the chief had made during a private meeting that he reportedly made during a private meeting and was really taken out of context. He was a little more than upset about this, and it's really important, of course, in all situations for the chief to be impartial and neutral. But the release, of course, took that to call for the resignation of the Attorney General and probably the Premier. And the chief and I had a discussion at the time. Was this worth responding to? Was the misinformation significant enough to correct? Was it really a ploy to get him to make a statement about the situation in general? In the end, we decided it wasn't worth a response, and that it would simply give them a platform that they didn't really have. The news was not actually covered, and no one asked us for a response on this release. So I think we made the right decision there. Now, although we've had less direct requests for comment or action in recent months, the commentary on social media has actually gotten significantly more polarized and opinionated especially in the past few weeks. I should note that this is mostly on Twitter, but the rhetoric has actually caused us to make the decision to disable comments where possible on our weekly public service announcements. So just on those posts on the platforms where we can, we decided that we did not need to be a space for the kind of rhetoric and language that was being put out there in those spaces. We're really providing a public service announcement and an awareness of what's happening. So the increased rhetoric brought up the discussion about whether we should be, in fact, engaging in these conversations, whether we should be correcting the narrative or defending the decisions that we've made as a police agency. So two pieces to share on that. If you were at CPRS last year, Chantal Hébert made a very eloquent statement that the issues that consume social media are not the issues that consume Canadians. And I think that's very relevant to what is happening here. Despite the uptick in social media commentary, we've had actually no media inquiries about our actions or our decisions, and very, very few community inquiries into our offices. And where that has happened, they generally include screenshots of the social media commentary and the inflamed response that's happening on there, and just sort of wondering about some of the misinformation that's being conveyed. And in most cases, the comments and the calls for action from police are in fact hooks. So for example, people are asking us to enforce the Motor Vehicle Act, they're asking us to enforce bylaws ahead of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And these are conversations that we really can't win if we get hooked into these conversations. So for example, we have one person who has been really adamant about the Motor Vehicle Act and the short blocking of traffic that's occurred, but in counter demonstrations shows up with signs that say not Vic PD do your job or Vic PD please enforce bylaws, but in fact says things like Palestine does not exist. So we understand where the real agenda is with a lot of the commentary that's happening here. And just as a side note, just because you don't see mass arrests or announcements about investigations doesn't mean that they're not happening. As I noted earlier, police are actively engaged in all aspects of these events, including monitoring online activity. And the public really is not entitled to know when an investigation starts. That could in fact do harm to the investigation. And the public is usually informed when charges are approved, and that becomes public information. So these are some of the comments that we have just as an example there. So a few key points of learning from our 66 weeks of demonstrations. Lesson one is that clarity really matters. So in our first full community update or media advisory that we put out, we included this sentence, which seems pretty simple. Our intent was to make it clear that submitting a plan for a marching demonstration was not a guarantee of safety during that demonstration. So simply put, we'll do our best to block traffic, but we really can't, ensure that we're going to block off every car and every access to that street. And really, you're making the choice to walk in the middle of the street. But immediately, we had comments and questions about what information we had that would make the march risky. Did we know of a planned attack against the demonstration? Were we going to let vehicles through on purpose? And remember, at this point, this is really near the beginning, everyone is really scared. And so we quickly realized that the wording, while meant to cover us for a liability, was in fact problematic. And so next week we switched to a little more clarity, that it's inherently unsafe to walk in open streets due to traffic, and that they do so at their own risk. So what became really clear to us in the second week of demonstrations or regular communications about the demonstrations, was just how much of a platform and a voice that we had in this arena, and how important it would be for us to be completely clear and carefully considerate of every aspect of our communications, even something that we would consider as routine as a traffic alert. Realizing the weight of everything that we were communicating was a really big eye-opener for me early on in these events. And even though we label them as traffic updates, they're so much more. They're an opportunity to make a statement about safety and to, again, manage expectations and about rights and responsibilities. Our second lesson was about the power of a word. So within a few weeks, it became very clear that we'd be experiencing weekly protests for some time, and our communications became more routine. So this is what a typical headline would look like as we prepared sort of the weekly notice. Traffic disruptions expected again this weekend for a planned demonstration, which seems simple. There's nothing contentious there, just basic information. But there's actually one word in that sentence which almost took down our entire relationships with the demonstration planners. And that word is again. The organizers felt that the word underplayed the seriousness of what they were protesting about, that they felt that it was dismissive and made it seem annoying or obnoxious that it was happening again. It took away from the gravity of the situation and made them sound like a nuisance. So this was relayed to us by a protest liaison team. And I'm not proud to say that my first reaction, I was not impressed. They wanted us to not use this word, and my reaction was, who are they to tell me how to communicate with the rest of our audience about our actions? But it really became clear very quickly that this word was so important that the future of the relationships of our on-the-ground staff, our protest liaison teams, with the organizers depended on whether or not this word existed in there. And they made it very clear that they would actually no longer meet with our PLTs if we used this word again. So I should also note that they took exception to the word disruption, but we genuinely couldn't find a better alternative for that, and we've kept that one there. And I don't think disruption is too necessarily negative, and so we've kept that one there. A couple pieces to highlight in this lesson is that this is the first time we realized how closely organizers were paying attention to what we were putting out, because it wasn't just a traffic alert. Again, I spoke to how large our platform can be here at VicBD. We were the only ones talking about what was happening. We were the only ones sort of putting out a public message about the fact that these demonstrations were occurring, and our reach and our influence was really measured by them to be significant in elevating the message and what they wanted people to start paying attention to. So our third lesson was about balancing values. So soon after we stopped using the word again, we were asked to stop including maps of our planned protest routes. So typically, if we know there's going to be a demonstration, we put out a map. We have an idea of where people are going so that people can plan ahead. There was genuine fear that counter-protesters were going to use the information that we provided to plan an attack on the demonstrators. They really genuinely felt that their lives were at risk because of our traffic alerts. Now, we use maps to let people know which areas of the downtown core to avoid, so they don't get stuck waiting between streets or waiting for the march to clear. It helps give the locals and visitors a small sense of control if they know where and when things are going to be happening, and it's a useful tool for tourism operators who are looking to provide visitors with a positive experience. So again, I'll note that we were the only people sharing this information. However, it became clear that if we kept using the maps, organizers were no longer going to provide us with our planned route. So imagine trying to keep a group of 250 to 600 people safe by shutting down roads ahead of their march when you actually have no idea where they're going to be going next. So clearly our only option then was to stop publishing the maps. Now, this became problematic in a few ways. One, it made us a less useful resource for information about what was happening. Secondly, it violated the trust we've built with our audiences about clear and transparent communications, and it really went against our principles of transparency. We also didn't have a good way to address why we made the change. So when people asked where will they be and why didn't you have a map this time, we had to really carefully consider the messaging, because by this point, of course, it was clear that any message that we put out would be highly criticized. And we landed on simply saying that the maps may be provided when they're finalized by the organizer. And for those who were paying really close attention, there was the underlying message of what we were sending by making this change. Was it being perceived that our relationship with protesters were breaking down and we didn't have the maps anymore, or that we were simply trying to hide information, or nefariously, if we believed that there would in fact be harm planned for the demonstrators, and if we provided the information, and it would be reinforcing a fear that still very much exists. In the end, safety of the people who are exercising their rights was the bottom line, and we decided that our reputation could handle the shift of moving away from maps, and I think it has. I should note we do still get comments asking why we don't include the maps or the streets where the demonstrations will be. We don't generally address those directly anymore, and it's just become a part of the routine that we don't include the maps for these particular demonstrations. So, in summary, we've been able to manage risk and maintain a focus on supporting rights and freedoms in a communications environment full of pitfalls, full of opportunities to make big mistakes, and a lot of attempts to trap us into engaging in the public discourse where it's really not a place for police to be engaging. Through months of discussion and lessons learned, we settled into a maintenance phase of issuing weekly news releases and responding occasionally to demands for actions or rise with really educational information. We continue to be engaged in the ongoing changes, which has included changes in demonstration leadership, the encampment that happened at UVic, unplanned pop-up demonstrations that have occurred, and the increased rhetoric that we're seeing now, and of course, this week's announcement about the ceasefire that's going to happen in Gaza. We continue to have conversations about whether what we're doing is the right fit, whether it's enough. And in preparing for today, I reviewed our strategy over the last year and a bit with our commander. And we really, on reflection, feel like we've done the right thing. We've really managed to keep it in the right lines. Our approach to communications may have to change, particularly maybe this week given global events, but for now, we're still maintaining that sweet spot where it allows our officers to do their work and remain focused on protecting rights and freedoms while helping everyone ensure that they feel safe and not taking any kind of a partisan stance. In preparing this presentation, I really took a good journey through all the steps that brought us to this state. And I can tell you that some of the most important things are to be at the table from the beginning. You never want to be doing catch-up on communications in an issues management situation like this. To build the trust and the relationships before you need it. To borrow freely from best practices. And to always consider the magnitude of any message, no matter how small. And if I can sum up in 3 important words, I would say focus on clarity, consistency, and transparency. So what to do when the impacts of a global event show up at your door or the door of your client? So first, I encourage you to consider very carefully before recommending that your employee take a position or a stance on a global event, or your employer rather. Even though we may feel strongly about the activities taking place, it's important to consider the second and third order effects of making a public statement. Consider who in your community, among your customer or your client base, is going to be hurt by a statement. It's very easy to become the target when you decide to take a stand or a partisan stance. We actually had a recent request this week to be included in an ad calling out anti-Semitism. We declined that because, although generally, of course, hate has no place in our community, it was very specific about anti-Semitism, and I wanted to be clear that hate of any kind has no place in our community. And it was a difficult conversation that got down into the line of whether or not Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are in line or are similar to each other. And of course, at that time, you just didn't disengage from the conversation. As stressed earlier, all of our communications came down to allowing our officers to keep doing their job in an unbiased environment, because that's the thing that keeps people safe. And so I know that these events are not all limited to, and the impacts of these are not all limited to policing weekly protests. So my question for you as a group is, what have you encountered in this similar vein? What advice have you been given or are given or giving to your leaders? And what, from your perspective, I'd be happy to hear, could we be doing differently? So let's chat, and I will just stop sharing about this. And we can have some conversations and questions.
So feel free if you want to. You can either raise your hand, come on the mic, or in the chat, whatever is best for you.
I can't find the hand raise function because I'm a Luddite. So, Cheryl, first, thanks for a really thought-provoking presentation, and really happy I was able to take part today. I have to drop off in 3 minutes, but it really cause for reflection in terms of our approach. I work in the Office of the Provincial Health Officer, for those that don't know, and one of our challenges is when and when not to engage. And seems like a zero-sum game in many ways. When we do engage, it's like full of risk. We deliberately don't have social channels. But I think, one of the things that I really took away from this presentation, probably my biggest takeaway, was the power of just one word and really being deliberate. I'm fortunate to work with a really good wordsmith, but I think one of the challenges that we face that maybe we can learn from this is that the value of engaging and building trust by engaging. And even if it's not being done like in a public or traditional mainstream media setting, there are other ways to reach your publics. And anyway, I just want to say thanks and thought-provoking. But to your question, I think it's like when to engage, when not to engage. And so maybe the only lesson I can apply is that sometimes the value of not engaging is that it doesn't give credence or credibility to a discussion that's sometimes already going to be outside of your control. But we're in a bit of a different light than you are as a public safety organization. So maybe I'll pause there.
Thanks, Andy. I really appreciate that feedback. Yeah, I agree. It's a really important balance of when do you engage, when do you correct misinformation, and as you said exactly, give credence to the conversation that's happening there, right? And this is the ongoing daily discussion that we have about when we see the commentary, when there's misinformation, whether it's in media or social media, is how important and what is the impact of correcting that, and in the case of policing. Sometimes we actually can't share information, and we just have to be the bad guys. I can think of numerous times when really incorrect information is out there, but it's going to endanger somebody's safety if we correct that information. And so we are the bad guys, and that's part of it, anyways. And in this case, maybe we're the bad guys because we allow people to exercise their rights and freedoms. But
how dare you let people do that? But no, truthfully though, I think it is such a tricky thing, and I don't think many people in the public understand the restrictions that agencies are under, whether it's policing or governments or public facing organizations, and the challenge of knowing when and when not to share information. But yeah, it's anyway, I have lots of thoughts on this. I think another lesson that I'm getting is this whole space of dis and misinformation, and when to confront it, who to confront it with, and how to confront it. And I'm always all ears to any ideas folks might have on that. But anyway, I have to drop off now, but it's great to see you, and thanks for this presentation.
Thanks for being here. I see one hand up. I see Michelle has a hand up.
Great presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I liked what you were talking about, with the maps, something as simple as maps. And for anyone who doesn't know me, I work in communications and engagement at the City of Victoria. So we have our own social media things that going on. But when you stopped using the maps, did you say in the presentation, sorry if you did, didn't catch it, did you actually say why? Did anyone, when people first started asking where are the maps, did you actually respond on social media saying the reason, or did you just choose not to respond?
I'm pretty sure this is going back a ways now. I'm pretty sure we actually did respond at the beginning to some comments, and we had said that our planned response would be the maps could maybe be provided when they're finalized by the organizers. We never had much of it. It wasn't a big conversation. It may have just been a couple responses to comments, but in the end, honestly, although we still get some comments asking like what streets and things like that. Generally people have just accepted that this is where it is. Another piece of that is, we actually don't always know. Realistically, it's not a reasonable expectation that people are going to do what they even say they're going to do, right? These are people who are demonstrating, and they may share that they have a plan and then decide to do something different. And those conversations happen afterwards as well, right? About how we can effectively keep people safe if they don't follow the plan. But we can't guarantee where people are actually going to be at different times either.
And I just had a second thought. Because I do work at the city, and I do engage the public and community groups about safety and the budget and all that. And of course, the police play a role in that. I guess the question would be, you really don't have a choice to not accompany protesters if your whole goal is, safety for everyone, including the protesters. And then that must be adding to your budget if you were having so many, because you said that was it 2023 you had 71, and then you went up to what in 2024 131, I think you said, or something like that. Yeah, so that must get expensive if you're saying it's on people's overtime.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. In fact, so it is overtime. We have a memorandum of understanding with the legislature. So demonstrations which start or end at the legislature, even if they include a component that goes off of the grounds currently, are cost recovered from the legislature. So that's the actual policing of the demonstration. But all of that work in leading up to the demonstration, those relationship building pieces, all of the sort of monitoring, that's just part of honestly, it's part of policing in a capital city. I think that's just something we have to accept.
Thanks.
I see Olivia has a hand up.
Yes. Hello. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi. Just going back to what you shared with at the beginning of the presentation, speaking to being more thoughtful in your social media approach, which leads you to, I would assume, less posts as a result. I'm just curious, what do you attribute any social media metrics to that? Like how would that have shifted any metrics? Because typically it's reach and followers and likes and stuff like that. And if you're going with a reduced approach, did you modify your metrics?
No, so I don't think that this has really impacted our audience. Our audiences have continued to grow and our engagement is solid and continues to continue to be so. We engage certainly less on this particular topic, but we're very active with all of the different aspects. We're a very busy police department, and we have a lot going on where we like to be very transparent. As an example, yesterday we put out our use of force report, which is already reported out, but we had done a special report for the BC Human Rights Commissioner, and we thought we would share that with everybody as part of our transparency as well. We have lots of good news stories, officers, making arrests or doing nice things in the community. So we continue our regular tempo of positive engagement, crime-related stories, letting the community know what police officers have been up to. It's just that when it comes to these demonstrations, we don't actively engage in the conversations and the pieces like the calls to action to end them or arrest people or do things like that. And just to be really clear, the balance, if you start making arrests during a demonstration, you're going to incite action on the other side, right? So the safest thing to do is if there's nothing unsafe occurring or nothing blatantly horrible happening, is to just keep things going, like just let the demonstration occur and then follow up action. And that's what's actually happening here in Victoria. is follow-up action. So to answer your question though, in terms of engagement, no, our engagement is still really good. Comments are on and engagement is keeping going for everything else. We've just recently disabled comments on the specific demonstration posts, the announcements. I don't think that that's had a negative impact. It's only been about a week or 2 weeks that we've done that. And we'll see if there's going to be a shift in terms of whether demonstrations keep occurring after this week with the ceasefire that's been announced. But I think it's really important that generally we approach every demonstration as an individual event, not as something that has been piling on. It is an individual event and we're just providing information. In that case, people who really want to use the information to start that negative conversation are just reposting it with their own thoughts and things like that. It's just that our space is no longer that forum for some of the really negative rhetoric that has gotten out there.
Right. Great, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Any other questions? I don't see any hands up. I can't see Ali for everybody.
I think that was everybody. Unless there's anything else, we can get everyone back into our days. As I do wrap up, definitely a special thank you to Cheryl for this very informative talk. I'm glad that more people were able to enjoy it and learn from it. Of course, enjoy is a strong word for a serious topic, but very informative. And thank you to your University of Victoria Police for allowing you to share these details with us so that we can all learn and take that back to our professions and be more thoughtful with our communications. If there's any CPRS Vancouver Island members in the room or watching the recording that have a talk that they'd like to share, please reach out. We'd like to learn from all of our members' expertise and provide opportunities for speaking and going. Well, so once more, thank you again, and we shall hopefully connect with you again soon at another event. Thank you.